Welcome to the Resilient Earth podcast, where we talk with speakers from the United States and around the world about the critical issues facing our planet and the positive actions people are taking. From the tiniest of actions to the grandest of gestures, so that we can continue to thrive and survive for generations to come. I'm Leanne Lindsay, producer and host, along with co-hosts and co-producers Scott and Tree Mercer of Mendocino Whale and Seal Study, located on the South Mendocino and North Sonoma coasts. The music for this podcast is by Eric Alleman, an international composer, pianist, and writer living in the Sea Ridge. Discover more of his music, animations, ballet, stage, and film work at ericalleman.com. You can find Resilient Earth on Spotify, Apple, and Amazon podcasts, iHeartRadio, YouTube, SoundCloud, and wherever you find your podcasts. In this week's episode, we are taking on Trump's executive order at the end of April about offshore drilling, which has begun this week again here in California off the coastline of Santa Barbara by Houston-based Sable Offshore. Next week, we're going to talk about deep sea mining and what's happening there. One of the biggest and longest-term defenders of our oceans and coasts is a senior fellow at the Ocean Foundation, Richard Charter, who lives just down the coast from us in Bodega Bay. When he wrote to me that these people pushing for offshore drilling are going for places right off Sea Ranch, right off Gualala, right off Point Arena, all the way up to Mendocino Village, right off the coast there, I knew we had to talk about this. We'll start the episode with a couple of news clips, then we'll dive into the conversation I had with Richard this week. You might ask, why isn't that a good thing to drill for these resources? Don't we need more oil and minerals to power our devices, our cars, and now AI? Aren't there great stores of resources just waiting for the taking? Well, let's talk about that. Have we forgotten about the devastating oil spills of the past that decades later still have ongoing negative impacts to those fragile ecosystems, which in turn is not good for us either? There's a complex cycle of life underneath these shining oceans that we look out upon. A cycle of life that, powers the very oxygen we breathe. They're the lungs of this planet. Humans have a great deal of hubris and often a vast ignorance as to the destructive actions they take and mask as, let's say, for national security or for American prosperity. Yeah, those words are being thrown around quite a bit lately. Hubris is excessive pride or dangerous overconfidence, often synonymous with arrogance. Both of these topics, offshore drilling and mining, as well as deep sea mining, have a number of people up in arms, wondering what can they do? Well, we're going to talk about what organizations like Surfrider, Ocean Conservancy, and NRDC, the National Resources Defense Council, are doing to take action. You can support them if you wish, or you can take action now with our legal representatives, and there's always ways to protest. And the next day after this executive order for offshore drilling, what struck many of us in the environmental community as completely bonkers was that NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, came out with a gushing press release in support of that executive order. Something was off. So I dug a bit and discovered it was a White House transplant from the Trump administration. Kim Doster, who was installed that month of April as NOAA's Director of Communications in advance of that executive order. They planned it all. We'll start the episode with a couple of news clips, then the conversation I had with Richard this week. The last time again we spoke was how President Biden was protecting our coast right at the end of his term. We were extremely worried back then that the Trump administration would come in and do everything they could to bulldoze through that, tear it all up any way they could. So here we are, back discussing it again. Richard mentions how decades ago, singer-songwriter Bonnie Raitt even got involved in the protests in Fort Bragg against offshore drilling. So what can we do, again, about this danger to our coasts, to our fragile ecosystems, to our fishing and tourism industries, to the people who live and thrive along our coastal areas all across our country? Keep listening and find out. At the end, I'll give you more details and insight. I'll even play an old movie clip that applies even more so today. I'm Leanne Lindsay, producer and host of Resilient Earth Radio. Thanks for listening and supporting our efforts to bring you critical issues and positive actions.
Environmental leaders are speaking out after the Trump administration called to reopen our national coast to oil and drilling. Surfrider, a nonprofit that works to protect and preserve oceans and coastal beaches, about the impact offshore drilling has on our coast.
Offshore drilling is a dirty and damaging practice, very harmful to the environment through every stage of the process. But it's also very harmful to coastal communities and economies. And so what we've seen over the past 15 years is incredible grassroots opposition. Use seismic blasting, which is loud sounds or explosions. So that's very damaging to whales and dolphins and other kinds of marine mammals. We need to be looking at renewables. We need to be looking at solar and wind and geothermal, supporting energy efficiency. And ultimately, we can't drill our way to energy independence. It's a finite resource. So that's our goal, is to get Congress to act and to pass a law to permanently protect not just South Carolina, but other regions of the U.S. from new offshore oil drilling.
The California Coastal Commission is imposing a hefty fine on a Texas oil company for working in a protected area off the Gaviota coast. Hundreds of people spent the day listing the pros and cons of restarting the pipeline that ruptured in the 2015 Refugio oil spill. News Channel reporter Mina Wahab has the details.
If we can't protect our coastline and our waters and our homeland, what do we have left?
It's a question that's been on the minds of seasoned and budding environmentalists.
We request that you enforce every one of their recommendations on this lawless entity, Sable. Thank you very much. I hope you do the right thing.
Thursday, the Coastal Commission voted 9-2 in favor of imposing penalties against Sable Offshore.
The people in the commission staff and on the Coastal Commission are very frustrated that they've been trying to work cooperatively with a company that hasn't been working with them at all.
For months, environmentalists have been urging the Coastal Commission to hold Sable Offshore accountable for what they say is a clear violation of a stop work order and irreversible damage of the surrounding habitat. It all came to a halt Thursday. Sable now faces an $18 million penalty, an order to restore the environment it allegedly damaged, and a long-term cease and desist order.
They imposed the maximum penalty, so that shows how upset the Coastal Commission was. In fact, several commissioners said they were so frustrated. They said, we don't have to be here. We shouldn't be here. If Sable had just followed the law, submitted its applications to do all this work on the Gaviota coast, they might have had permits by now.
In terms of next steps, environmentalists say they hope the Attorney General steps in to make sure Sable is unable to restart the pipeline. In Santa Barbara, I'm News Channel reporter Mina Wahab.
Hey, Richard, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today to talk about such a serious situation that's facing us.
What is that? We have so many emergencies on the environment right now. It's hard
I
to
know. It's hard to also weather them. Everybody is a bit in overload.
Well, I have learned that the younger people are taking it hard because they don't remember James Watt. We remember James Watt. He was going to do a lot of bad things and he didn't because we were patient and we outlasted him. And I used to have a friend in Florida who was with the Sierra Club. He was about 90 years old. And he used to always tell me, just don't worry about it, Richard, just outlive them.
Just outlive them. That's one way to get back.
Outlive them. And so that's my theory this time.
Well, why don't we dive right in and talk about what the serious issue today that we are talking about when it comes to offshore drilling, the executive order, and what has been happening since then, what can be done, why is this not a good idea, even though the phrase continues to be used, and that is for national security and for American prosperity. Almost everywhere you look about reports in support of offshore drilling, you'll hear that phrase. And what can people do? So take it away, Richard.
Well, what we are facing right now is a deadline for public comment of June 16th. So there's still time to deal with this for what is called the 5-year offshore oil and gas leasing program. And the 5-year oil and gas leasing program this time differs from every previous one. The last few administrations, first of all, we've had first a congressional moratorium and then a presidential moratorium. So they've never included California. This time, the Trump administration is focusing specifically on California. And in spite of the fact that on January 6th, the previous president justifiably and honorably issued what's called an executive withdrawal that included the whole California coast, the whole Pacific coast. And that's been standing up in court, that Section 12A of the OCS Lands Act type of withdrawal.
That's what we talked about the last episode with you. Yes.
Right. Done by Obama previously in Alaska. The court held it up. Upheld it, but Trump's pretending it doesn't exist. Even as yesterday, a bill began to move in the House of Representatives to abolish the Biden withdrawals. So we know that the Republicans think it must be going to work because they think they have to reverse it in Congress. Trump is just ignoring it and saying, well, I'll drill everywhere. We call it drill, maybe drill. And the 5-year offshore leasing program is specifically focused on the most sensitive parts of the California coast, including, for the first time ever, within our national marine sanctuaries.
Unheard of.
And so that's illegal because national marine sanctuaries generally have a designation document, they have a management plan, and they have regulations that ban, for example, Greater Farallones bans any disturbance of the seabed. So you couldn't even build a pipeline. But the Interior Department is proceeding as if national marine sanctuaries are open season. And that, of course, has caused the number of people with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, here in California to leave the agency just recently, because they were told that they would have to approve permits for offshore drilling in sanctuary waters if they stayed. They were also told if they didn't wear their badge all the time while they were at work, they'd be fired. So we've had a series of resignations, early retirement, what's called the fork in the road retirement, where people with extreme amounts of knowledge and competence have left the agency suddenly. So we're losing what I call institutional memory
And
from
I
NOAA.
had a chance to speak with the superintendent of the Greater Fair Lawns and Cordell Bank, Maria Brown, recently in person. And she had told me that when they came in and they cut the 20%, they didn't ask her to go in and look at the perhaps lowest performing areas.
Yeah,
They took her top scientists.
yeah.
And they're coming for another 20%, she said. So not only
Yeah.
are they gutting these agencies, but they're installing their own people too, as I could
Yeah.
tell just by looking at who wrote the press release in support of these executive orders for both offshore drilling and for deep sea mining. And this woman came from the White House. Anyway, so that you see where these changes are happening.
And this is all being architecturally designed very carefully by the oil and gas industry, who put up most of the money for the Trump victory in the campaign. And we've known for several years that a group called the Heritage Foundation, ironically named, they have an office on Capitol Hill. I used to walk by it every day on my way to work. The idea being that they would undo as much as possible of the nation's environmental laws, and they are literally gutting the environmental protections in order to go after drilling in areas where it's previously been outlawed. And where they do go after it, they have done things like remove the safety mechanisms that would prevent another Deepwater Horizon, deepwater blowout preventers, and how often those would be inspected. They're going after posting of a bond by oil companies to make sure that if something does go wrong, the taxpayer doesn't have to pay for it. And so first, if you're going to attack something, you remove the protection, which we're seeing with the personnel that have left NOAA now. And then you remove the laws that can be used to protect it in court. And then you go after the heart of the coast. And that's exactly what they're doing. And so we're taking advantage of the first opportunity to comment, which is right now.
And if anybody has a track record of understanding these issues, it's you and the Ocean Foundation for the decades of work you have put into protecting our coast. And you must have seen so much happen over these decades.
Keep in mind that the Fort Bragg oil hearing, which took place in, I think, about 1985, was the largest then and remains the largest public hearing in the history of the state of California. It went on for 23 hours continuously, with people from the community coming in to testify against drilling off of Mendocino. And it was still going on. There were still 700 people signed up to testify when the Interior Department Secretary then Hodel shut down the hearing, and we had to have the Mendocino Children's Choir sing the Ballad of the Mendocino Coast as we gave T-shirts to the hearing panel that said, "I survived the Mendocino oil hearing," and they marched out. This was to prevent a riot. I mean, there were still 700 people signed up to testify, and they were listening to Bonnie Raitt play music on a flatbed truck out in front of the hall in Fort Bragg. So we have some history here in this particular.
And that was Bonnie Raitt in person, wasn't it?
That was Bonnie Raitt in person. And we have seen on this coast a confrontation between the people that love the ocean and the oil industry. We've seen that about 3 times. I think this is the 4th time where it's been, them or us. And so I'm not giving up. We beat these people before. And we have, as a Secretary of Interior, a gentleman who his background is developing accounting software that was called Great Plains. And
Oh, I
anyone
remember that. Yeah.
anyone who was in the accounting business, in that, you know, chief financial officer, they call it great pains because it was a flawed piece of software. So that's who is now in charge of our coast. And I think we will outlast him, frankly. I think this business of, going after marine sanctuaries, frankly, is a real mistake. I mean, just even from their point of view, it's technologically a mistake because they can't drill safely. We keep having spills here, as you know. And secondly, these people don't know what they're doing, and they have no idea that a national marine sanctuary is the most defensible of any of our coastal protections. So they're headed into a big storm, but they've gotten rid of the NOAA scientists that could have protected the storm. Predicted the storm. There's nobody to save them from what they've set themselves up for.
Well, I know there's a number of locals in Mendocino and Sonoma counties that have responded to a lot of the social media posts that I have been putting out there to raise awareness about this June 16th comment period timeline that we've got until that date. And there are a lot of people who are up in arms about this that do not want this to happen along our coast. So they're all asking what to do.
We have made it as easy as possible to take action because Interior Department has a very complex website with lots of long URLs and whatnot. So we put a new facade on that. We put a new coat of paint on it at savemycoast.org, savemycoast.org, and that will allow you in 2 clicks to comment on the 5-year leasing program. Now there's some things to know as you comment. It's very easy to comment. What you say is important. We don't want to just generate a lot of comments like "don't do it" and have them say, "Well, everybody had the same comment." It's like somehow or another we need to have people talk about what they know about this coast. If you're a commercial fisherman and you have a particularly productive spot out there, talk about that. If you know something about the geology of the area, talk about that, because this all happens, as you'll see, as you click through the website and wind up in the comment area. They're looking for what is called a comparative analysis. In other words, relative environmental sensitivity versus potential for oil. And here, that equation is always a low potential oil reserve versus high environmental sensitivity, the highest environmental sensitivity because of the ocean upwelling systems, where you have irreplaceable upwelling of nutrients from the deep sea, one of the foremost productive upwelling systems on the planet right here. And then you start looking where the oil is. And this is why, of course, we have expanded the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary. We would have liked to have taken it further than Point Arena, but we took it to Point Arena. And the reason we did that is because we know that the areas where the oil industry has previously wanted to drill are right off of Bodega Head, right off of Sea Ranch, immediately in front of Sea Ranch, right off of Gualala, right off of Point Arena itself. In fact, where the existing Farallon Sanctuary ends at Alder Creek, north of Point Arena, the oil industry seems to think there's some interest outside of the sanctuary boundary there, as well as inside the sanctuary, and then moving north right off of Mendocino Village, which is why we had the largest public hearing in the history of California, logically in Mendocino Village. These people are going after the heart of our coast.
I think people here in Sea Ranch too, once they get informed better about what's happening, will also pitch in as well.
So.
Yes.
I think so.
Now, we're talking about the northern California coast along the Sonoma, Mendocino counties, but down in the Santa Barbara area, you sent me the news about Sable, and I looked at more news about that. Why don't we touch on that for a moment, if you would?
We had in 2015 a pipeline carrying offshore oil called the American Plains Pipeline Company, or Plains Pipeline, broke open in 2015 on the east side, on the shoreline side of the freeway, 101 freeway in Santa Barbara County.
A decade ago.
2015. And the Refugio pipeline turned out to be as thin as an onion skin. It had not been monitored. It had not been what they call pigged to inspect its integrity, and it broke open. And a gentleman in Texas who was operating the pipeline, the pump station, he saw a drop in pressure up in Santa Barbara from Texas, skyscraper in Houston. He turned up the pressure higher, and that caused this rupture in the pipeline to leak more oil. The oil then went through a culvert under the highway, under Highway 101, and into the ocean. Never needed to go in the ocean. There was no spill response plan. The oil leaked under Highway 101 through a long culvert. If I'd been there, I'd be probably in jail. I would have taken a backhoe. This was an agricultural area. I would have taken a backhoe and plugged the culvert. I probably would have then driven the backhoe into the hole. And I would have then showed
Anything
up.
to stop that.
Right, anything to stop it from getting in the ocean. I probably then would have gone to the Coastal Commission and said, I forgot to get a permit, because this was all happening very rapidly, but nobody did anything. They let it go into the ocean, where it traveled 150 miles on the ocean. And so, you have an unnecessary spill caused by negligence that caused irreparable damage to the ecosystem. It's still being analyzed what happened there. That never needed to reach the ocean. And then this was servicing oil from 3 offshore platforms called Heritage, Harmony, and Hondo. And of course, those platforms were shut down because the pipeline that transported their oil was broken. A company called Sable, a smaller company, is now just yesterday restarted those 3 platforms and is planning to, without complying with the number of orders by various state agencies, including in particular the California Coastal Commission, went ahead and started the platforms and plans to restart producing oil.
And severe penalties even.
Yeah, and severe penalties, and they're just above the law. As far as we can tell, they think they're above the law. And if you look at this in the context of the 5-year offshore leasing program, where we're going to have new leasing, what we see is the reason that the industry, the oil industry, is so interested in that particular area, Santa Barbara Channel, is that at the north end of the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary, there are tracts within the sanctuary that they want to lease, we think within a year. I mean, everything's been speeded up. Once the 5-year program is finalized, this Interior Department is devising shortcuts for the normal environmental studies and environmental documents that would have to be done, so they can shortcut those permits and get in there. So they're targeting. First, I would, all the evidence points toward they're targeting the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary first for drilling.
And it seems like with the executive order, it's not, it seems like it includes both drilling for oil, but also for minerals.
That will be, we believe, a separate executive order. In other words, there is the offshore oil and gas leasing 5-year program. James Watt, when he was Secretary of Interior in about 1982, tried to do what was called a hard minerals leasing program. And he specifically targeted an area off of Humboldt County, Del Norte County, and Southern Oregon, up about as far north as Coos Bay, for what is called the Gorder Ridge lease sale. And this was partly off the Northern California coast, partly off of the coast of Oregon. And the idea was that minerals called polymetallic sulfides that are found around seafloor hydrothermal vents or hot springs on the seafloor would be extracted, basically bulldozed with remote undersea bulldozers, ground up, and the slurry brought to shore. Probably, it appears the slurry would be brought to shore in Humboldt Bay, in an approved
And
harbor in Humboldt Bay.
these polymetallic, what they also call the nodules, right?
Different,
Are
different.
different. Okay.
There's three kinds of subsea mining. One is what we have here close to the California coast, which is the polymetallic sulfides, copper, lead, and zinc, primarily low value minerals. Then there are minerals that plate themselves, almost like electroplating, onto vertical structures. There's one in the Monterey Bay Sanctuary called the Davidson Seamount. There appears to be some interest in subsea mining around Santa Rosa Island in the Santa Barbara Channel. That will be a separate comment period. And meanwhile, on the seafloor, the International Seabed Authority, which is a global decision-making body, is looking at what are called basically nodules or rocks that are spread across the seafloor that have cobalt and manganese in an area called the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, which runs from Hawaii roughly to Mexico. It's wider than the continental US. And that process is not finished determining that it can be done safely. They know that some exploration that they did on the deep sea for nodules actually 50 years later, half a century later, still showed damage to the seafloor. So President Trump and his interest in proceeding without having to consult other countries, and because the U.S. is not part of the International Seabed Authority, he yesterday declared that American Samoa, which has an exclusive economic zone, which is U.S. waters, but American Samoa, of course, has a moratorium on seabed mining. He disregarded that and said, we're going to have seabed mining off of American Samoa under U.S. authority. Now, it's an authority we don't have because we never signed the law of the sea, but he is going to try to do seabed mining off of American Samoa. And these are very large remote controlled devices that crawl along the seabed and tear everything to pieces, basically, or suck up the nodules. The nodules are alpha emitters. They're radioactive enough that it violates EPA regulations to process these on a ship in terms of radioactive exposure. But here in California, we expect the mining of the seabed to begin off of Humboldt and Del Norte County, and then eventually off of Santa Rosa Island in the Santa Barbara Channel. But that comment period has not been named yet.
Thanks for clarifying that, because I've watched a congressional hearing recently with both the metals company out of Vancouver and Impossible Metals and some scientific experts. Jared Huffman was there. And that is, again, about that deep sea mining aspect. There are some crossovers. So I wanted to clarify some of that, because we are talking about that in next week's episode of Resilient Earth. And there's a lot to be discussed about that. And the Clarion Clipper Zone was one area that the metals company has a lease in. But when it comes to some of the language, it also says offshore seabed minerals. So I wanted to get a clarification of where those territories lie.
We are watching both very carefully. We're watching the oil drilling proposal closest because we're a third of the way through the comment period. Counties are looking at resolutions. The state of California, the state of Oregon, and the state of Washington have in the past have worked together to confront this type of thing. I can't predict, but I believe that I have some evidence that that will happen again, a unified front between California, Oregon, and Washington to confront what Secretary Berglund is trying to do here off of California. But we're not done with that yet. And once we're done with that, we will move on and pay very close attention to deep sea minerals. if anybody wants to learn about deep sea minerals, for some reason, I'm not sure why we did this, but exactly 1 year ago, we did a film, a 20-minute documentary at thedeepmovie.org, and you can learn more than you ever wanted to know about deep sea mining and all of the impacts at thedeepmovie.org. And, while you're eating dinner, well, maybe not while you're eating dinner, but, at your leisure.
It's an excellent film.
Yeah.
Now, I know that going back to the offshore drilling, that Surfrider organization has actually taken a lawsuit out against the Trump administration, and the defenders of wildlife have also been taking action. So there are a lot of groups that seem to be lining up to take action along with the Ocean Foundation.
We have some very good lawyers in those groups you mentioned, working for those groups.
That's good to hear. People really want to know, can they help? There are ways to support those organizations by contributing monetarily to them, but tactical actions that people can take right now are crafting messages of impact for this comment period before June 16th. And your website there, Save My Coast,
SaveMyCoast.org.
gives the link to that federal agency where you can
Correct.
respond.
Correct. And what we have found in the past with federal agencies that try to do irrational things to the California coast, they don't know any of the history of how people feel about this coast, or the history. As Peter Douglas used to always say, the California coast is never saved. It's always in the process of being saved. He was absolutely right. It's always in the process of being saved. So you get federal agency, third floor of the Department of Interior on 18th and C Street in Washington, D.C., and they think, oh, here's a map of California, Oregon, and Washington. We'll just drill anywhere we want. And whenever that happens, or whenever that has happened in the past, they underestimate the backlash. In other words, they have no idea what they're getting into. And so we need to remind them. And of course, this time, not only are they targeting national marine sanctuaries, but we have a series, a whole network on this coast. Coastal planners come from all over the world to study how we protect this coast. We have marine protected areas that were created by the state of California through a negotiating process, consent and consensus by various stakeholders that lie in many cases within the sanctuaries, or between the sanctuaries. And as we were doing these state marine protected areas, the operational theory was they needed to be close enough together so that if one of them got hit by a disaster, chemical spill, oil spill, any kind of problem like that, that the others would be close enough to be able to genetically serve as a genetic reservoir to replenish the marine protected areas to the north and south. The currents reverse off this coast. They go north part of the year. Then there's a nearshore countercurrent going south part of the year. So the idea being that there's a ability here to create a scientific basis for these comments. In other words, we're not just saying we're worried about the view. We're worried about the ecosystem, the fishery, our economy, which is based on a clean coast, period.
Fishing industry.
Yeah, they will be weighing in, I have been assured. Because
and then you have all the tourism, of course, and the ecotourism and the environments. These are fragile underwater environments. And these MPAs, these marine protected areas, have been showing how valuable that conservation and protection has been over time as they've studied it.
I have met with teams of people from Indonesia and elsewhere. They travel here specifically to study how we protect this coast, the network of marine protected areas at the state level, the national marine sanctuaries at the federal level, and then, of course, things like the Biden withdrawals, making it off limits, illegal, to put, offshore drilling here, and they want to go home to their country and create a similar network of protections. This is a model for the whole world, what we've done on the California coast. And so I don't think the Interior Department really has come to realize what they've run into. The buzzsaw of public opinion and vital economic interests. This is not, just some random coastline somewhere. This is the place that people decided to create a model for coastal protection. And I think that consciousness is going to arise again, partly in new generations. But we're going to have to demonstrate it. We can't just assume that the Interior Department is going to figure all this out without our help. We're helping the Interior Department. We made it easier to access their comment website, which was arcane and hard to get to. SaveMyCoast.org is pretty easy to remember. People can submit a comment while they're waiting for their dentist to get to their opinion. They're not going to take our coast to the dentist, that's for sure.
So what happens after June 16th?
We don't know. One thing we've noticed, the reason our website has a headline that says drill, maybe drill. One thing that we've all noticed about the Trump administration is that they change their minds a lot.
On a dime.
About a lot of things. This is one of the factors that drove people crazy who were working at NOAA, had to decide what they were going to do as employees for NOAA. Was one day they'd say your job is gone, the next day they'd say your job is fine, and the next day your job is gone, and it was driving them nuts. And so they quit, because you can't function in a world like that. This was when Elon Musk was in charge of firing people, and that now he seems to have gone back to his Tesla factory and making strangely shaped trucks. But the bottom line is that this was deliberately presented to people within the agency to be confusing. Could Trump change his mind about drilling off of California? Absolutely. He's changed his mind about 3 times a week.
Look at tariffs.
Yeah.
And
so
businesses just don't work that way. They need to have some sort of ability to forecast. And if you have constantly changing things, it's hard for even businesses to function, let alone people.
They call it a 5-year plan. It's not a plan if it gets changed every time they have a whim. One thing we have here in California, we're getting really tired of these oil spills. Not only the Refugio spill in 2015, but again, off of Huntington Beach in 2021, we had a subsea pipeline that was supposed to be buried in the seafloor, and it was supposed to have a fail-safe mechanism at the platform so that if the pressure dropped, we shut off the flow of oil. The pressure drop didn't shut off the flow of oil. They're still investigating as to whether somebody had short-circuited that fail-safe mechanism. The burial of the pipeline, encasing it in concrete, appears to have, it was a condition of the actual permit from the Coast Commission, but it looks like it was never done. So an anchor on a ship, a container ship, looks like it caught the pipeline, dragged it, and broke it. You can't come to a state like California, where we've had these environmental insults one after another, whether you start with 69, the blowout in Santa Barbara, Union Oil Platform A blowout in 69, which even Richard Nixon, when he came to see it, he created most of the environmental laws that Trump is now removing, because Richard Nixon came out and looked at the Santa Barbara blowout. Now we have, about every 5 years, we have an accident with our remaining offshore oil facilities, and we're phasing it out for that reason. In California, we're sick and tired of companies that are with full knowledge operate with negligence and destroy our coast. And so I think that's another factor that is going to play into these comments. We've had it. We don't need any more spills here from this industry. If they wanted to operate here, they could have been precautionary enough to act safely. They could be precautionary enough to respect our national marine sanctuaries, but we're not going to go easily when they come along and say, oh, the sanctuaries are where we want to drill. That's what they're saying now. Well, sorry, it's illegal. You know, it took 25 years to create these sanctuaries and then expand them. We have layers of protection. Each one will wind up in court. You know, Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary was actually created through passage of a law. It was part of the Hurricane Andrew Relief Act that was rebuilding Florida after a huge hurricane. You can't just undo these things with a scribble on a piece of paper with a pen and call it an executive order. That's not how the American government works.
What are the final words that you might have for our listeners and viewers?
Quit listening to me. Go to savemycoast.org. If you can't remember that, it's savemycoast.org, and take 5 minutes, the next 5 minutes, and tell them what you think. Not hard to do. And you can ask that your email address not be published, and if you want. And the bottom line is, collectively, they're going to, I predict, get more comments from California than any other state. I mean, obviously, there are projects going on in other states. You mentioned Surfrider and Defenders of Wildlife. There's a lot going on around the country, but this movement to protect our coast didn't just happen by accident on the Mendocino Sonoma coast. It began here. It's still here. I know it's still here. You know, the bottom line is tell them what you think, and then tell them what you think, and tell them we're tired of spills and we're not having any more drilling here.
Surfrider, as a matter of fact, I went to their website and they have some suggestions on different writing samples, approaches that you could take, and to show your connection with the coast. And you brought up a great reason earlier about if you know the geology or you have any experience with, you know, any kind of activity along the coast, use that in your writing.
Yes, yes. The law itself, the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, first of all, you got to respect the withdrawals that were done in January. You can't just ignore them. They're the law of the land. You can't just pretend they don't exist. But beyond that, the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act specifically talks about balancing. It's called critical balancing in the law, the relative environmental sensitivity of an area with its potential for producing oil and gas. If you have high environmental sensitivity and a low potential for producing oil and gas, that helps you save the coast. And that's part of the law. This law didn't just pop up. It actually came about through a deliberative process that took several years, actually started in 1953 and was, you know, remodeled basically in 1978. But you can't just wipe out, you know, 20 years of legal precedent by taking a pen and dragging it up and down a piece of paper like this president seems to think he can do.
Especially for little short-term gain, for really big long-term risks.
I don't talk about climate anymore because climate makes people mad in Washington, but we are going to suffer as a society and as a nation and as a planet because this particular administration is essentially outlawing the use of the term climate change.
Right.
That doesn't make it go away.
No.
It just means it's which posture. An ostrich buries its head
in the sand.
It buries its head in the sand. Well, sorry, but yes, you could bury your head in the sand and we'll all come back 10 years from now and wonder why we wasted 10 years not dealing with climate. But you know, right now we're going to save our coast, and one way or the other, in court, you know, or in a hearing room, or if I dare them to come to Mendocino and hold another public hearing, I We didn't even have social media when we had the largest public hearing in history in Fort Bragg. I dare them to come back to Fort Bragg and hold a hearing. They better allow a week or two of testimony. And Bonnie Raitt's still around and she loves this issue. Maybe she'll come back.
One of my favorite musicians and singers of all time.
She played a very large role in starting the coastal protection movement off of Mendocino. A lot of people don't remember, but she was always the person who raised the money for the coastal fight here back in the day. And she has history here, and she was just like first in line to perform anytime. You say offshore drilling to Bonnie Raitt, and then you get some extra microphones.
I love it. Well, Richard, thank you so much for coming on the show today and talking about this critical issue and giving us some of your vast knowledge on this topic.
Thank you so much. And remember, June 16th is not that far away. Don't think you'll do this later. Do it now, please.
Absolutely. June 16th.
Thank you.
Keep that in mind, everybody. Thank you, Richard.
Thanks a lot.
All right, take care. Let's listen now to California Congressman Jared Huffman, who has been a member of the Natural Resources Committee for over a decade and has been serving recently as the ranking member or lead Democrat of the Subcommittee on Water, Wildlife, and Fisheries. Here's what he had to say to longtime journalist and co-founder of Blue Frontier organization, David Helvarg, who asks these two important questions in a recent episode of Rising Tide, the ocean podcast, which he founded and co-hosts.
So, two quick questions. With the Trump administration gutting NOAA, firing the commandant of the Coast Guard, promoting offshore oil drilling and deep sea mining, even putting mercury back in the tuna by letting pollution controls wash away, what are you able to do to protect our public seas, given the MAGA majority in the House and Senate? And what can you do and what can our listeners do?
Yeah, look, we're going the wrong direction here under the Trump administration. They are trying to roll back decades of policy progress. They are gutting agencies across the board that we depend on for science and for marine ecosystem sustainability and commercial fishing and so many other things. They're also at an even higher level trying to tear down our democracy, which will make it really hard to push good policy in the future. Totalitarian regimes generally aren't all that sustainable.
Yeah, democracy seems like a prerequisite for getting any environmental protections going.
I think so. So look, we're fighting on all fronts. We've got to prevent this administration, which hopefully will just be a 4-year anomaly in the arc of progress, but prevent them from doing things that are irreparable, doing things that'll make it even harder for us to be a leader on the global stage. We're sometimes an outlier on things like Law of the Sea Treaty and any number of other multilateral instruments where we should be leading. And yeah, what he's doing with deep sea mining is just making us even more of a Lone Ranger, if not a pariah.
Yeah, it's like we'd be the new pirates. I mean, the U.S. hasn't signed on, but we've always been in compliance with the law of the seas.
Right.
And we've actually gotten to good place in fisheries, and he's getting rid of those.
Yeah, so we will have to relearn painful lessons, right? I hope we don't have to, relearn the lessons of the cod and other fisheries that we've totally crashed with overfishing, but it seems like we're heading that way.
Right. So you're doing what you can here on the Hill in Congress. What do citizens do to not feel frustrated, to feel that they're doing something?
There's a number of things. You can support the groups that are lawyered up and fighting these things in court. But the other thing is, as consumers, I still think that we have a huge role to play. And American consumers don't want to have illicitly caught fish in their seafood supply chain. They don't want to have slave labor on their dinner menu. That, I think, continues to be a really important aspect of this.
So make it to consumer choices, take them to court, take it to the streets.
Take it to the streets.
For decades, we've talked and talked about the need to end America's century-long addiction to fossil fuels. If we're going to prevent large parts of this earth from becoming not only inhospitable, but uninhabitable in our lifetimes, we're going to have to keep some fossil fuels in the ground rather than burn them and release more dangerous pollution into the sky. Today, as we look to the Gulf, we see an entire way of life being threatened by a menacing cloud of black crude. We will condemn our children to a planet beyond their capacity to repair.
Thank you, former President Obama and then Vice President and later President Biden. Which brings me back to something Richard Charter of the Ocean Foundation said to me in this episode that we recorded this week, that we're not going to take it anymore. It reminded me of that 1970s movie, Network.
All I know is that first, you've got to get mad. You've got to say, I'm a human being. God damn it. My life has value. So, I want you to get up now. I want all of you to get up out of your chairs. I want you to get up right now and go to the window, open it, and stick your head out and yell, I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore. I want you to get up right now. Get up, go to your windows, open them, and stick your head out and yell, I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore. Things have got to change.
How many stations does this go out?
You've got to get mad.
67.
Say,
I know it goes to Louisville and Atlanta.
I'm not going to take this anymore. Then we'll figure out what to do about the depression and the inflation and the oil crisis. But first, get up out of your chairs, open the window, stick your head out and yell, and say, I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore.
Who are you talking to, Herb?
CGG, Atlanta.
Are they yelling in Atlanta, Herb?
Are they yelling in Atlanta, Ted? But first, you've got to get mad. You've got to say, I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore.
They're yelling in Baton Rouge.
That was a clip from the 1976 film Network. Seems tailor-made for us today. Remember, you have until June 16th to make your voice heard about offshore drilling along our California coast and other U.S. coasts. Go to SaveMyCoast.org and protest with everything you've got. Thanks for listening to the Resilient Earth podcast, where we talk about critical issues and positive actions for our planet. Resilient Earth is produced by Planet Centric Media, a 501c3 nonprofit, and Seastorm Studios, Inc., located on the rugged North Sonoma coast of Northern California. I'm Leanne Lindsay, producer and host, along with co-hosts and co-producers Scott and Tree Mercer of Mendocino Whale and Seal Study, located on the South Mendocino and North Sonoma coasts. The music for this podcast is by Eric Alleman, an international composer, pianist, and writer living in the Sea Ridge. Discover more of his music, animations, ballet, stage, and film work at ericalleman.com. You can find Resilient Earth on Spotify, Apple, and Amazon podcasts, iHeartRadio, YouTube, SoundCloud, and wherever you find your podcasts. Please support us by subscribing or donating to our cause.